Hello and welcome to another edition of Timetable London. With me, your host, Tam MacDonald of Cradle of English, and my redoubtable co-host, Dr. Geoff Browell of King's College London. Today we're coming to you from the historic Crown Tavern overlooking Clerkenwell Green, the setting for Oliver Twist's famous pickpocketing scene, as well as the starting point for the world's first May Day march in 1890. The pub was built in the early 19th century and was later given a typical Victorian upgrade and still has many original Victorian features. Indeed, you may recognize the Crown's distinctive Golden Apollo Lounge, where we find ourselves today, where scenes from the British film Notes on a Scandal, featuring Dame Judi Dench and Cate Blanchett, were filmed. But the main reason for us coming to the Crown today is that this is where Lenin is said to have met Stalin for the first time in 1905. Lenin had recently moved the publication of the Russian socialist newspaper Iskra to Clerkenwell Green, which is just around a corner or two here, and Stalin had come to London to train as a Bolshevik. We'll have to ask our guest how you train as a Bolshevik. But anyways, and he was staying at the nearby Tower Hotel, presumably not the monstrosity that sits there at the moment. Anyway, who better to tell us more about our esteemed guest than my co-host, Geoff, who's an old mate. I understand the two of you are pubster buddies of old. Giles Milton, what can we say about him that the world doesn't know?
Well, thank you, Tam. Well, Giles, you're a best-selling author. You're an internationally renowned historian, you're a broadcaster now, and you're moving into other areas that you can tell us all about during the course of this pubcast. But first of all, I'd like to ask you a simple question. Who was more evil, Hitler or Stalin? Now, this is particularly, not Hitler or Stalin. Who is more evil, Lenin or Stalin? And I ask this question because reading through your oeuvre, I see that there has been a gentle move from, I would say, the Tudor historians area, so 16th century, 17th century with some of your early works, through to the 20th century, World War II, and the dictators of the 20th century. So, welcome, Giles.
Thank you very much. What a question to kick off with. Who was more evil? Well, I think I can say the answer straight away, and that is Joseph Stalin. I mean, Joseph Stalin, his track record is quite remarkable in just how many people he managed to kill. Starting off, of course, with, he provoked the famine in the Ukraine. Millions died of starvation as he tried to wipe out the kulaks, the rich peasants, And then, of course, you go through, the war years. I mean, arguably, the Soviets had to sacrifice a lot of citizens, but perhaps not quite as many as Stalin would throw into the front line of battle with very little weaponry. And then, of course, you go, there's also the show trials where, numerous people were killed, the gulags. I mean, his record in mass murder is really quite impressive.
So would you just say that he lacked any sort of moral compass whatsoever? Was he a psychopath, for example?
I've been reading an awful lot about him because I've been writing about the team of British and Americans who worked alongside Stalin during the war. So these are Brits and Americans who were sent to Moscow to basically prop up our ally, Uncle Joe, in the Kremlin. And so they got to know him extremely well. They saw him on a daily basis. They worked with him in his office in the Kremlin. And they were all mystified by Joseph Stalin. They simply couldn't make him out because to them, he was always charming. He was always courteous. He was extremely well read. He was brilliantly well informed. And they would all come away at the end of the war saying Joseph Stalin, of the big three wartime leaders, Churchill, Stalin and Roosevelt, undoubtedly Stalin was the most skillful as a leader. And yet they had to square this fact with what they also knew was that he was a mass murderer on a monumental scale. And one of those Americans, Averell Harriman, who was Roosevelt's direct envoy to Joseph Stalin, he said at the end of it, after all this time, after everything I've seen of Stalin, he remains a total enigma to me. How can somebody so charming and courteous to me personally also have killed millions of his own people?
What do you think the answer to that is?
I don't know. Did he have a split personality? It's so difficult to know.
Maybe he had this sort of human need for moral balance in his life, and he thought, I'm doing all this bad stuff, I should be showing a good side to my nature so that some element in posterity recognizes what a cuddly guy I really am.
Yeah, and I think, Churchill famously went to Moscow in the summer of 1942 to meet with Stalin face to face. He's meeting his great enemy. All his political life, he's detested both the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin personally. And he goes to meet him, and the British ambassador at the time, Archie Clark Kerr, he says it's peculiar to see these two men together. He says it's almost like they need each other. They're both very needy individuals. Yeah. They want the other one to like them. And this bizarre sort of charade takes place, and Churchill goes to eat in Stalin's private dining offices in the Kremlin. He's served by Svetlana, Stalin's daughter, and Churchill's immensely proud of this. And he comes back and tells how wonderful it's been and how fabulous Stalin is. And this is a period, of course, Stalin is our ally, and he's a much-needed ally. And so we in the West have to convert him from Stalin the monster to cuddly Uncle Joe. He becomes, in the press, this avuncular figure. But a lot of it is just a complete construct, you know. A lot of people who were working in Moscow, Westerners, knew that they were dealing with a monster, and a very devious monster at that.
It was the deviousness and the guile that he displayed, presumably to get to where he got to, that is quite notable, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most cynical things of all I came across was the famous Katyn massacre, which is where tens of thousands of Polish officers, Polish intellectuals, you know, they were murdered in cold blood in Katyn Forest. And when the Soviets recovered that territory in, I think it was 1943, the question was, you know, on everyone's lips, well, who actually committed this massacre? Was it the Nazis or was it the Soviets? You know, it was an open question. And what Stalin did, he sent along a whole bunch of reporters to go into Katyn Forest to see the exhumation of the corpses. And as they're exhumed, they all had letters and diaries on them and everything. So these were taken out of their pockets. And all of these letters proved, I've used that in inverted commas, proved that the Nazis had committed this atrocity. In fact, Stalin himself had ordered this atrocities. It was the Soviets that had committed this atrocity, and what they'd done, this was a gigantic operation of fake news. So they'd faked all the documents on these bodies to make it look like the Nazis had done it. I mean, an extraordinarily cynical operation, and one that was temporarily successful.
And so it was fear that kept him in power, wasn't it? The fear that he could instill in others.
Yeah, I think that's the important factor, is that they were terrified of him. Everyone was terrified of him. He was completely unpredictable, and you never knew when he was going to turn on you. So, yeah, they were all in unspeakable fear, really, except for one. There's one notable moment, which I think is absolutely fascinating about Joseph Stalin, which is on the night of the 22nd of June, 1941, when the Nazis invade the Soviet Union. And Stalin has been warned for weeks and weeks and weeks that they're about to invade, and he doesn't believe it. And when he hears that it has actually happened, he has essentially a nervous breakdown. He retires to his dacha in the countryside outside Moscow. He hides himself away. He won't see anyone. He won't take a phone call from anyone for 6 days. And this is a crisis, moment of absolute crisis. The Wehrmacht is advancing incredibly rapidly. And it takes a sort of group of commissars eventually pluck up the courage to go and see him, and they find Stalin cowering in his dacha, and he thinks they've come to shoot him. And in fact, they've come to tell him, take lead of the Soviet Union or we are going to be defeated. And he does. He sort of turns it around at that point, and he says, okay, I'll become the leader of the Soviet Union. I will lead this battle from the front. And that's the complete transformation into Stalin, the wartime leader.
And how old was he at this point? Because we think of these dictators, well, I do anyway, as almost ageless. When I think of Hitler, and when Hitler died, he was only in his mid-50s.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary. One thinks of Hitler as being perpetually late middle-aged, one would say. But they weren't necessarily. How old was Stalin?
I can't remember his birthday. I mean, he was young.
79, wasn't it? 1879?
Right, so that makes him, I'm not very good at maths.
So 40, 50,
63?
Yeah, so he's the youngest of the wartime leaders. And that is very, very noticeable on the three occasions they're going to meet. One is at Tehran end of 1943. They're going to meet again in Yalta in 1945, and then there'll be a third conference with a lot of changes taking place in the summer of 1945. At these conferences, everyone notices two things. One, Churchill, old, tired, drinking far too much, as one of his aides said.
God, I feel like that sounds like me.
One of his
I
aides,
wasn't going to say, Jeff.
well, Jeff, drinking bucketfuls of Caucasian champagne. Is that what you do?
Definitely not me. No, I'm afraid my income doesn't support that. But
so that's Churchill at these conferences, and then there's Roosevelt, of course, old, sick, very sick. In fact, he arrives at the Yalta conference. And he looks terrible, and everyone says, "My God, he's pale, he's ashen-faced, he's not functioning properly." There's a reason for that. Roosevelt's dying, and he'll be dead in April 1945. So just a few months after the Yalta conference, he's dead.
Yeah.
And so in these conferences, you have sort of Stalin is the dominant figure. Not just he dominates the conference debates, but sort of physically and mentally, you feel he's stronger than the others as well.
was he a tall man?
Stalin? No, he wasn't tall. And there are two things that struck me. One of it, everyone who meets him comments that he looks much smaller. He's sort of like a small teddy bear, but not quite as cuddly, maybe. And also, they all wanted to shake his hand so they could go home and say to, their family, "I've shook Stalin's hand." And they're all expecting this rod iron handshake, that would rip their arm off. In fact, he had this incredibly effeminate handshake, very, very weak, which took them all by surprise.
But how did he, coming to power, because he was the sort of quiet man who came to power, wasn't he?
You make him sound like Ian Duncan Smith, the quiet man in politics.
Beware the quiet man.
Stalin, Ian Duncan Smith of the Soviet Union.
I was going to say, you stole my line. I was actually going to say he came up from nowhere and was sort of melded into the shadows, a bit like a sort of evil version of John Major.
Yeah, but he had quite a good track record. If you go back to his youth, what did he do in his youth? In Tiflis, in Georgia, he was a bank robber. He was a criminal. He was in with a criminal gang, and that sort of set his credentials, really. He was a gangster. And he behaved like a gangster, I think, for all his life, actually, even his political life. He was, the way he acted, the way he treated others, he was a bullying gangster.
So his basic instincts in social as well as professional as well as commercial life, everything was gangsterish.
It was gangsterish, but it was clever gangster. So I think my guys that I wrote about, the Brits and Americans sent in to work alongside him, they were constantly warning Washington and Whitehall, underestimate this man at your peril, because they said he was treated in the capitals a bit like sort of an ignorant peasant, and of course he was from a very simple background, from a terrible family. His father was an alcoholic and beat his mother up and everything. So very bad, very difficult background. And so he tended to be treated as this kind of ignorant idiot who'd never travelled everywhere. And when these guys got to Moscow and got to know him, they were really alarmed. They go, "This guy is far more shrewd than you're giving him credit for. And, when you meet him, just understand he's a master of his brief. He knows exactly what he wants. And if you're not careful, he's going to run circles around you."
Mm-hmm. Can you imagine sitting where we are sitting now? Can you imagine Stalin sitting here having a pint of beer with Lenin? Does it make, from what you know of him, does it make sense? I know you'd have been much younger, but...
I'll tell you what Stalin would have done. We'd all be sitting here with vodka glasses, and we'd all be knocking them back, and he'd be encouraging us to knock them back, and 1, 2, 3, down they go, And Stalin would be knocking them back as well, except that his vodka glass would be full of water, because he didn't drink vodka, and he loved, and this is typical of his sort of manipulation of other people, he would get them all, riotously drunk while he remained sober. He did drink, but he drank white Caucasian wine was his chosen drink. He certainly would not be downing the vodka.
Is that because he liked to remain in control?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And he also kept, they noticed that he kept something always over his glass, so that nothing could be put into his glass. He'd take a sip, put it back down and put something on, a cover on top of it again. So he was utterly paranoid at all times.
Clever listeners amongst the people listening to this podcast will note that there was another voice just now, through Christopher Wynn, our esteemed executive producer, who very cleverly brought the subject of our conversation back to this pub, which prompts another line of questions for you. Why this? If they did come to this pub, and as you said earlier, we don't know.
At this very table.
Yeah, well, maybe. Nobody can say it wasn't. It may well not be fake news. But would it have been an accident, or would this pub have been at the center of a great outbreak of socialist and communist printers? And working men and revolutionary.
Yeah, this was the Socialist Revolutionary Centre of London, Clerkenwell, where we are, Clerkenwell Green. We know for a fact that when Lenin came to London, I think it was in 1902, he worked in the building that is now the Marxist Library, which is just a few blocks up from where we are sitting right now. If Stalin and Lenin met, I had a different date from you. I think you said 1905. I thought it was 1907 when it was the Marxist International Conference was held. And that's when it was not just Lenin and Stalin who came to London, but there was Trotsky was here, Zinoviev was here. There were a whole bunch of them came to London at that point. And it's very, very frustrating because I actually thought about writing a book about this. I was fascinated by the fact they were all in London. There's very, very little information I could find about their time in London. You're right, you mentioned the Tower Hotel, that's where Stalin stayed. And he had there was a kind of bellboy in the hotel who gave an interview shortly before he died. I mean, we're talking about many, many years ago. Yeah. And he remembers going out and buying toffee for Joseph Stalin. That's what he wanted to eat, you know. But honestly, there are fragments of information, and that's it about their time in London. But if they had drunk anywhere, this is the most likely place they would have drunk, because we're just literally just down the road from the Marxist Library, where which was known to Lenin, and this whole area was full of socialist revolutionaries. I mean, even people like William Morris were knocking around slightly earlier in round Clerkenwell. So it was known for its sort of revolutionary roots here.
Well, this is a man, I mean, Morris was renowned for being a revolutionary wallpaper designer, wasn't he?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, but that whole arts and crafts movement, but the whole arts and crafts movement had a whole socialist, background to it. So it's no accident that he ended up here as well.
What was the name of that conference again, so that we can all be running off to ChatGPT? And
wasn't it the Marxist International? I think.
Was it?
1907.
Yeah.
So we must look that up.
Okay.
We should
off we go.
Yeah.
Google it, really, shouldn't we? But,
so, well, what was its impact if we don't know what was said there? Was that something they had every 2 or 3 years? Or?
Yeah, they did. And I think this was really cemented. There were so many different factions. I think this is where Bolshevism became the chosen path.
Why?
I mean, I'm slightly hazy on this, I have to say. But I think that's where, there were the Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks, all sorts of fragments and, and so ultimately Bolshevism won through, and that would be the ideology for the Russian Revolution in 1917.
Why did they all come to London?
That's where it was held. I mean, they were travelling all over the place. They were held in different cities. Lenin, of course, lived in Zurich for a long time. In fact, you can visit his house in Zurich where he stayed. So they were, they were exiled as well. They were kicked out of Russia, Imperial Russia at the time. So they had to find a home somewhere. Switzerland, Zurich was a natural place because they welcomed anyone. Again, it had a reputation for, the whole Dada movement came from there. It was, they went to these conferences or congresses were held in all sorts of different cities.
The other conference venues are booked out, Chris. That's the reason why.
Very possibly.
They couldn't get the accommodation.
So to what extent is the answer to your question just the emergence of the English language is the language of business, that just about every revolutionary could have some English? Is maybe 100 years previously, that same conference would have been held in French.
That's quite likely. I mean, French for centuries was a language of diplomacy. Yeah. You're right, yeah.
I suppose Germany would have been, and German would have been the other option, wouldn't it? It's home of very, very many communist revolutionaries, wasn't it? Germany.
Yeah.
But not necessarily at that stage. So presumably agents and British agents would have been present at these congresses and possibly would have been sitting in this very room watching Lenin. I mean,
British agents were everywhere. Remember, this is the beginnings of the SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service, and now we know as MI6. That had been formed just prior to the First World War. And the British government wanted to shut it down. At the end of the First World War, they felt it was a sort of slightly ungentlemanly thing to be doing, spying on your enemies, How naive is that? And so the idea was to shut it down in 1918. But the Russian Revolution changed everything. Mansfield Cumming, who was the head of SIS at the time, said, hold on a minute, I can send in agents into Russia. You really need to know what's going on in Russia. I've got a bunch of men who are fluent Russian speakers. They've been brought up in St. Petersburg, so they were completely bilingual. I can send them in, they can infiltrate everything, and they can find out what's going on. And this proved the making of MI6, actually, because they came back and they gathered astonishing amount of information about the Red Army, about the Politburo, about everything. I mean, some of them were quite brilliant. Sir Paul Dukes, the only man ever to be knighted for espionage, who had like 4 different personas when he was in Moscow and Leningrad. There was Sidney Riley. I mean, for older listeners, they'll remember Riley, Ace of Spies, which was on TV.
My God.
Yeah. There was George Hill. They all lived under aliases. And really, they gathered so much information that the government realised, actually, hold on a minute, we need to keep this thing going. This is actually really, really useful. And the one story which I think is absolutely fascinating is the murder of Rasputin. Because the traditional story is that he was murdered by Prince Yusupov. In the Yusupov Palace. He was lured there, taken into the basement, and the story goes that he was fed cyanide, and then he was stabbed and he was shot and all this stuff. And Yusupov wrote about it in his memoirs, this great sort of detailed account of how he killed Rasputin. But
there's a Victor writing history.
Yeah, but there's a different story, which is almost certainly the truthful one, is that Yusupov was best friends with Oswald Rayner, who they were Oxford together, they studied modern languages together. And Oswald Rayner was living in the city, in St. Petersburg, or Petrograd as it was then, at that time. And he was working for SIS. And despite all the cyanide, the autopsy was done on Rasputin's corpse. There was no evidence of cyanide found in his stomach. He'd been beaten, he'd been mutilated. But the thing that killed Rasputin was a bullet through the forehead. And that was from a Webley revolver, which was standard issue to SIS at the time. And on his deathbed, Oswald Rayner admitted that he did him in. And so this whole story written by Yusupov was a complete fantasy. I mean, he was killed in the Yusupov Palace, but all this stuff about the poisoned cakes and everything was... And Rasputin managed to climb out of the basement, and then he was pulled back, and this incredible story. It was sold, Yusupov sold his memoirs to Hollywood, and it was turned into a Hollywood movie. Lost Splendor, it was called. So Yusupov was doing it to make money. One fascinating little, I love these little, anecdotes, is that Rasputin had a daughter called Maria. I didn't know anything about this, who then tried to sue Yusupov for making up this story. It went to court in Paris, and actually the judge threw it out. So this is absurd, So no, there is a whole alternative narrative, and I have to say I am never a believer in conspiracy theories, but this so stacks up, and it's so. It's also, the British absolutely wanted to get rid of Rasputin, because Rasputin was pouring words into the Tsarina's ear. The Tsarina's ear, she was German-born, had German sympathies, was trying to pull Russia out of the war, and the British were desperate to keep Russia in the First World War at this point. So there is a very good reason why the British wanted Rasputin dead.
Wow. Well, I never knew that. So no wonder the Russians today consider the British to be particularly, or Putin's regime, particularly devious.
Yeah. But you know what? I was thinking about it. I think that Anglo-Soviet relations have been absolutely appalling all the way through, with the exception of the Second World War. Because we kind of think that this is an aberration now, and it's terrible, our relationships with Russia. But actually, I think it's the norm. And that what was really weird is that we forged this alliance with Stalin for 5 years of the Second World War. And actually, they've been frosty all the way through. It's not like we suddenly became best buddies with Joseph Stalin. It was because Churchill took the decision on the day the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. He literally sat in Chequers. He had to make a speech broadcast live to the nation that night, 22nd of June, 1941, from Chequers. He had to make a broadcast to the nation saying what he was going to do about the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Yeah. He spent all day weighing up his options. All his aides were saying, you can't possibly back Joseph Stalin. That's absurd. All your life you've been saying how dreadful he is. And in a masterpiece of broadcasting, Churchill performs this extraordinary political U-turn. And he's very upfront with the British public. He says, No one has been more critical of the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin as I have all my life, But in this moment of our dire need, essentially he says, Hitler is worse than Stalin, and so we're going to back Stalin.
My enemy's enemy is my friend.
That really is what it is. Absolutely, yeah.
Hi, this is Tam MacDonald, your host. If you're enjoying Timetable London, then please tell your friends about us by sending them a link to the show, giving us a mention on social media, or even especially by chatting about us in the pub. Timetable London, for everything you love about the world's greatest city.
So how do you rate Churchill? So Churchill's come in for quite a lot of criticism recently, and he was criticised obviously in the First World War with Gallipoli, and then even in the period of the 1930s when he was calling out appeasement. You've read a great deal of Churchill's material, of his letters and so on and so forth, people you must have known him. So what is your rounded view of him?
I think the problem with all this criticism, it's done from a very contemporary point of view. I mean, I think when you're dealing with Churchill, you have to accept he was an old-fashioned imperialist. He believed in the British Empire. He was an aristocrat, so he had patrician views about everything. The fact with Churchill, for me, is in Britain's hour of desperate need, he made the right call. I think, that it was a brave political act to do exactly what all his advisors were telling him not to do, that you'll never get away with it. So I think what he did in 1941, and as a war leader, sort of overshadows absolutely everything else.
He was sort of propelled by a sense of providential destiny in his own role in history, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he probably had a massively inflated ego and everything, but he got things right when in the absolutely crucial times, and that surely overrides everything else.
Yeah.
So what's your answer to that question, Geoff, given what the archives have turned up since Churchill died? Is posterity beginning to get a grip on him as a good guy or a bad guy?
Oh, well, he was undoubtedly a good guy in my...
Yeah, but a lot of people are saying he's a bad guy now. I mean, I read that all the time on social media.
Yeah, no.
Then it must be true.
No, well, I mean, exactly. A lot of it's complete nonsense. That's the thing.
He was a man of his times, and everyone is trapped within their time of history.
Mm. But here's the thing you might not know. To prove his track record of hating the Soviet Union and Stalin, 1919, Winston Churchill is Minister of Munitions. What does he do? He sends the British Army and he sends masses of British weaponry into Russia to try and snuff out this annoying revolutionary regime that sprung up, overnight. And he brings the British Army together with the white Russian armies, with their three powerful generals. And unfortunately, it fails, this mission, and ultimately the Red Army wins. Extraordinarily, I always think it's quite remarkable that the Red Army pulled off a victory over three extremely competent generals. And a lot of the Western powers against them, not just Britain, but America was sending weaponry in as well. The Japanese as well were in Siberia. The Red Army pulls it off. But, so when Churchill described the Russian communists as, a league of failures, the morbid, the deranged, I mean, he has this fantastic expression. He meant it, and he had a track record to prove it, because he tried to snuff out this regime at birth.
Perhaps no one better qualified.
That leads through to the Second World War, doesn't it? And the White Russians and the Cossacks that Churchill had to send back.
Yes.
Was that part of the deal?
Well, that was part of the deal, and that's a terrible story of sending the Russians who'd fought for the Western Allies back to the Soviet Union, knowing they're going to end up in the gulags, or actually just be killed, which they were. I mean, just sort of liquidated. It's interesting because the sort of year that follows victory in the West, we don't really talk about very much, but it was a time of huge displacement, massacres taking place all over the place. 11 million ethnic Germans expelled from their homelands. We don't talk about that because they were beaten. So you sort of think, well, tough luck. That's just how it goes. 11 million. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. Yeah. Entire populations uprooted from Silesia, from Prussia, East Prussia. These places, Well,
one forgets that these days. Looking at Poland, actually large parts of northern Poland were East Prussia, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. And this was Stalin. Actually, here's an interesting thing about Poland, because Poland at the Yalta Conference was obviously one of the great talking points of what's going to happen to Poland after the war. Churchill rightly points out Britain went to war over Poland, and so he gave this magnificent monologue at the Yalta conference saying, for Great Britain and for me personally, Poland is a matter of honour. He gives a speech and everything, and everyone went, wow, Joseph Stalin, and this is how clever he is, he immediately stands up and he said, if Poland is a matter of honour for Mr. Churchill, it's a matter of life and death for the Soviet Union. And that's just one of many, many examples where he was able to turn Churchill's monologues to his own advantage, And of course, Poland, at the end of the war, well, Stalin gets his way because... you'll be familiar with there was a Polish government in exile living in London during the war. What did Stalin do? He set up a rival government in exile in Moscow, full of communists, and those are who he fully intended to take over Poland at the end of the war, which they duly did, and so Churchill did not get his way over Poland at all.
Did Stalin have a speechwriter?
He hated making speeches. He tried to avoid ever making speeches, and the reason why he was such an enigmatic, mysterious figure at the beginning of the war is he hadn't made a speech since 1937. And we're talking about 1941. And when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in June 41, Stalin again refused to go and announce it to the nation, and he made Molotov do it. Molotov, who was, terrible public speaker, stuttered and was all over the place. And he made him do it live broadcast to the nation. And then afterwards, Molotov came back and he said, well, I think you did okay.
Oh, dear.
So the answer is he tried wherever possible to avoid making speeches.
Did Hitler have a speechwriter?
I don't know, but I'm sure he did, and probably revised it and poured a bit more hate into the speeches. But Hitler, of course, famously practiced all the time, and there are even videos of that.
Well, who doesn't practice in front of the mirror, frankly?
Well, Churchill did, didn't he, down at Loftus in Kent? He used to stand in front of
Chartwell,
yeah. But he wrote his own, didn't he? His speech.
He did, and a case in point is the one I've been talking about on the 22nd of June. He personally wrote that speech, and he gave it out to his advisors, and they were saying, not sure about this, but he went with it.
So, well, go on, Tam.
I was just going to ask, how many of these themes and ideas that we've been talking about have come together in your most recent book, Giles? And when we look at Lenin and Stalin, is the book taking a new view on their relationship? Could they both have been who they are if the other one hadn't have existed?
It's really, because my book is really focused on the war. It's focused on the relationship between Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin. It's focused on this incredibly unlikely alliance and how how the war was won because of this alliance. And particularly it's focused on the Brits and Americans, really three people who managed that relationship during the war. So these are the people in Moscow. So people like Averell Harriman. But Averell Harriman, a very interesting character because he, in 1941, he was sent by Roosevelt as Roosevelt's personal envoy to Winston Churchill. So he first came to England. And, America already had an ambassador in London, but Roosevelt didn't like dealing with sort of bureaucrats and what have you, diplomats. He liked to have one person who could give his undiluted voice to Winston Churchill, which is that was the role that Harriman was charged with. Now, Harriman came to London with his 23-year-old, extremely glamorous and brilliantly intelligent young daughter, Kathy Harriman, a sort of typical American socialite. And Kathy Harriman wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters home to her sister, really, in New York, while she was first based in London and then went to Moscow to accompany her father into the Kremlin. And these letters were sent through the diplomatic bag, so they were not censored. So she could write whatever she wanted about Churchill, about Stalin, and about their entourages. And they're absolutely fascinating. And I heard about these letters and contacted the Harriman family. And Kathy's son, who's now in his 70s, he said, I've got hundreds of these things. I've got her scrapbooks, I've got her photograph albums and everything. Come to New York and I'll share them with you. Which I duly, when you're a historian and you hear that, Geoff, as an archivist, you'll know that you get on your plane to New York.
You do, yeah. That really is the mother lode when you come across something like that.
I bet.
Light up.
So I went over to New York, and it sort of started me off on an amazing paper trail, because first of all, you have these letters and really her descriptions of life in the Churchill household. She spent most of her weekends at Chequers, where they were going for safety. and have these incredibly vivid descriptions of the fraught, frantic atmosphere in Chequers, with all the chiefs of staff were there as well. She was there for all of the great moments in the early part of the Second World War. So she was in Chequers for Pearl Harbor. She describes in a very long letter to her sister, it's that wonderful stuff. She says that all day Churchill was hungover that day, and he'd been sitting in the main drawing room with his head in his hands. And they're all sitting around in the drawing room, and he flips on the radio at 9 o'clock, and he fumbles with the radio and misses the headlines on the 9 o'clock news. So they listen to the news, and then at the end it comes back to the headline, which is that they vaguely hear the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor, and they're all saying, did they say Pearl Harbor, Pearl River? What was it all about and everything? Anyway, they realise that the Japanese have bombed the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. And Churchill just rises up from his armchair and sort of jumps into the air. This is a great moment for him because he knows now there is a possibility of winning the war because America is certain to come into the Second World War. He runs and rings Roosevelt, gets him on the phone. All of this is described in her letter. So it's like having this fly-on-the-wall view of incredibly important moments in the Second World War. And then when she goes to Moscow, she'll do exactly the same with being with Stalin and his commissars.
So how do you begin researching a book? So how do you know what subject? First of all, the subject. And secondly, the archival research. Which comes first? Do you think I'd love to study, for example, white gold was your study of white slavery in the 17th, 18th centuries. Do you think I love the subject, I'm determined to find the sources no matter what? Or the other way around, or a bit of both?
Well, a bit of both. I mean, I'll have an idea and I'll see, is there enough material? Because as you well know, you never know what you're going to find in archives, and often stuff is still in private archives, like the Harriman, Kathy Harriman's letters, you know. So it involves a lot of research often, and you have to know, you know, a book is a major undertaking. You need a lot of stuff to make, you know, to fill 200, 300 pages of a book, you know. And also, I'm always looking out, I don't want the official records. They're often incredibly dry and boring. What you want is the personal diaries and letters of people who were there at the time. They give a much more intimate account of what was taking place, and that's what interests me.
Have you ever begun a project and then, say, 6 months in, you realise there isn't enough material?
No, because I really make sure there is. I mean, a couple of the books I did were focused on the East India Company, and that I found really fascinating. It was when I wrote my book, Nathaniel's Nutmeg, I mean, that was a deeply unfashionable subject, the East India Company. It's almost seen as a slight embarrassment because, you know, this is the beginnings of the British Empire, and we're all sort of not really very proud of that, you know. But what I realised going into the East India Company archive is they kept every single thing that was ever written. They kept, you know, obsessively. And so not just all the accounts of the voyages they were undertaking, but all the personal diaries and letters, copies of them were made and then kept. And so not just my book, Nathaniel's Nutmeg, which was all about the spice wars in the East Indies, but I wrote a book called Samurai William, which was about the first Englishman in Japan, William Adams, in 1600, all under the auspices of the East India Company. Everything survived. All the letters written by the guys out there trading, they were writing back to their families in England and describing life in Japan in 1600. Absolutely magnificent.
So how did you get into writing in the first place?
I just always wanted to write. I'm incapable of doing anything else. But I became a journalist, not because I wanted to be a journalist, but because I thought, at least if I'm a journalist, you know, I ring up a literary agent or a publisher, they'll at least vaguely take me seriously, you know, if I come from some sort of writing background. Yeah. One thing journalism teaches you, which is extremely, which my publishers love me for, which is I always hand the things in on time, because if you're a journalist and you don't hand something in on time, it doesn't go in the paper.
So you were a journalist and you just thought, now some journalists make the best historians, I've found. The most interesting books. Well, they delve in.
They do. And it's also, it is the art of telling a story. And it's the same, I think, if it's a 300-word article in a newspaper or if it's a 100,000 word book. It's the art of telling a story, knowing how to structure or craft a story. And of course, you're constrained by the facts, you're constrained by what material you've got. But nevertheless, you're shaping a story out of those facts, you know.
And the book you're working on?
The book I'm working on is called Island of Ghosts. And it is the subtitle is One Man's Obsession with the Remotest Place on Earth. And in fact, the sort of overall story is a man, an explorer, a celebrity explorer, one of the most famous men of his age, who tried to claim the entire Arctic for the British Empire.
God, that would have been wonderful, wouldn't it?
And the thing is, in those days, under international law, there were all these unclaimed islands. In fact, he explored the last unmapped area of the planet, first of all, and then he had all these islands. And in those days, you couldn't just sail to an island and plant the Union Jack on and say it's British now. You had to plant colonists on there. And this is where it all went badly wrong. And obviously, a lot of them died, but they all left diaries and letters, which is great. So I've been in America, actually, going through the Arctic Archive there, where a lot of this material is, in Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. His name is Stephenson. He's been completely forgotten because of what happened, but he was literally a global celebrity in the period where my book covers 1913 to 1923, so it's a decade. And he was great friends with the Wright brothers, who'd invented the aeroplane.
Yeah.
And he realised, and he was a visionary in some ways, he realised that the plane was going to transform the world in the way that Elizabethan galleons had transformed the world in the 1600s. And because he looked at a map and he said, well, if you want to fly from London to Tokyo, you obviously fly over the North Pole because it's by far the shortest route, shaves off thousands of miles. And in those days, aeroplanes had to refuel quite frequently. And so he said, we need to control, these islands are going to be of strategic, critical importance, and one more than all of them. And the book is focused on Wrangel Island, which is high in the Siberian Arctic. So it's above the northern coastline of Siberia. And this is the one he focused a lot of his energies on. And this is the one I'm writing about, the colony on Wrangel Island.
How's that spelled, Giles?
Wrangel is W-R-A-N-G-E-L.
G-E-L, Wrangel.
Wrangel.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Google ChatGPT, right?
It's now, ironically, this island was forgotten for years afterwards. Now it's assuming incredible strategic importance again because it stands at the mouth of the rapidly defrosting Northeast Passage. So the shipping lane across the north of Russia is soon going to become a viable proposition, and it's going to shave thousands of miles and thousands of pounds off every voyage.
Well, I think the Chinese have just pushed a container vessel through.
Have they?
In the last week.
Yeah.
So there's more to come.
And Stephenson, my guy, the other thing is he believed in submarines, which hadn't been invented that long before. He said submarines also are going to transform everything. There'll be submarines sailing under the Arctic ice pack, he said, and everyone roared with laughter at this. Of course, a few decades later, nuclear submarines were going under the ice pack.
Your books seem to enjoy giving the story or describing the story of heroes, I'd say, or people who are perhaps lost to the historical record. Would that be a sensible way of describing it?
I do. But yes, unknown heroes often. I mean, the wonderful, fascinating thing about Stephenson is he starts the book as a hero and ends the book very much as an anti-hero. And he the old saying, you live by the media, you die by the media. He became famous through the media, and the media were going to kill him off at the end. Which is why no one's heard of him. I mean,
Well, we're going to have to read the book. We're not going to ask you what he got up to or what went wrong. But we'll have to. When will it be published?
Well, probably not for a while, unfortunately. I've almost finished the draft of it, so I'll hand it in a few months.
So is it 2 years or so that it takes you from the earliest conception to publication?
It's about 2 years of pretty hard work as well. I mean, I try not to take on too much. As a writer, you have to do all the literary festivals. There's all the sort of promotional stuff you have to do. Well,
you've done broadcasting recently, haven't you?
Actually, I do TV, and I don't enjoy TV nearly as much as I love doing radio.
You've done series, though, haven't you?
Yeah, I have. I turned my book on D-Day into that was a 2-part documentary, and I did one on the end of the Second World War as well, which was obviously the 80th anniversary, was a few months ago. Yeah. So we turned that into we did a documentary on that. But I kind of love radio and podcasts, really.
Yeah.
The joy of your books is that you tell the story behind the story.
Yes.
You don't do the obvious story. You go into the personalities behind the story, which is what I love.
Yes.
It's stories where you say, gosh, I never knew.
Because there's always interesting stuff beneath the story that you kind of know and you've learnt at school. Well, yeah.
There are thousands of those stories locked up in archives around the country and hundreds of thousands.
I mean, you must have so many things that would make good books.
I do. I'm not mentioning them whatsoever, unless you buy me another pint.
Well, I think when I finish this book, I'm going to take you out and get you roaringly drunk and get you to spill all these stories out.
Absolutely.
Give me my next book.
I have got one or two, but there you are. So are you going to be going back in time, do you think, for your next book, the one after this current one?
I don't know. It's early days. I mean, it's very early days. I've really loved writing about this period, sort of, as I say, 1930, 1923. This was a period where explorers still went off in +4s and tweeds, you know. Yeah. It's the age of the glorious amateur, and there's something wonderful about that.
I could think of just the collection for you.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but it's... sorry, Tam.
We're just bringing the past and the future together and thinking of the memories we have of rooms, and this room as well, being possibly the lunch venue for Lenin and Stalin.
Yeah.
If we could go back to that time when they would have had to have been fairly young blokes at that time.
They would.
20s and early 30s sort of thing.
Yeah.
So insofar as a lot of it is guesswork, but if you can imagine, if you can project into the Stalin of that day, what might he say as a sort of a mea culpa if he could come down the track 120 years, listen to what we've been doing, talking about him? Do you think he'd recognize himself? And
how would he defend himself? Do you,
or indeed, what message would he have for us, representing posterity 120 years later?
My goodness. I don't think he'd think much of what we've been saying today, to be honest.
Well, he'd want his own podcast, wouldn't he?
Yeah, he would. And he'd probably exterminate all his enemy, you know, all the enemy rival podcasts would be wiped off the air, you know.
Well, that's not a bad idea.
Studying Stalin.
I mean, I think I'd be more interested to meet Stalin than Lenin, actually. Lenin always struck me as rather boring, sort of boring intellectual, terribly grey character. Stalin would at least be malevolently interesting, I think.
Yeah, the devil with all the best lines.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Hitler, Stalin, Churchill, dinner table.
Oof.
Which would you go with?
Oh, Hitler would be so boring, I think.
Yeah.
He'd be incredibly
always
rambling on
droning
about,
on,
Yeah. Ooh, yeah. I don't know.
Churchill would be fun.
Churchill would be fun. At least you'd be completely pissed by the end of it.
He loved posterity, though, didn't he? He really was quite obsessed with his own positioning.
Yes,
well, there's that, but he's also a natural storyteller too. And this thing I've always loved about him, the saying that he sent the English language into battle. A great one for words and so on. I think that he would be an extremely interesting dinner guest.
I think you'd have to take a lot of what he said with a pinch of salt, because he was very good at bigging himself up. And, the memoirs of Lord Moran, who was his physician, who travelled everywhere with him, he frequently corrects said it wasn't quite like Churchill said it. I was there and this is what happened.
But Giles, surely, just talking relatively only, if you look at the people today, not to mention any names of the sort that we've been struggling not to mention today, but when we think about him bigging himself up, and all this stuff about I'm really smart and I know things that other people don't know and I know more about my generals. I'd imagine that Churchill was a good deal more fluent.
Oh, and he knew his history and absolutely. Very well read, extremely well read. And and a great conversationalist. I mean, he would have been incredibly entertaining. I'm not sure Stalin would have been very entertaining, frankly. Okay,
dictators don't have a great sense of humour, do they?
No, I don't think they do.
Goes with the job, disappears with the job.
Yeah, I can't think of a single joke that Stalin told, or Hitler for that matter.
The Stalin joke book. It's a big good research project for you.
One page long.
I was going to say he always died when he tried to tell a joke, but it was other people that did.
Absolutely, you didn't laugh. Yeah.
Have you guys heard the story about Churchill at some social do? I think I'm attributing it to the correct figure in Churchill, but he was asked by somebody poking his belly sticking out what he was going to name the baby. You remember this?
No.
Have you come across this?
No.
So somebody comes up to him and has the temerity to poke Mr. Churchill in the belly and says, "So what are you going to call it, Mr. Churchill?" And he said, "Well, I was thinking that if it's a boy, I shall call it Giles. If it's I'll get this right. If it's a girl, I'll call it Priscilla. But if, as I suspect, it's flatulence, I'll call it after what did you say your name was?"
Excuse me. This is why we don't let Tam talk too much on these occasions. He always lowers the tone.
Well,
I've got a joke. I mean, a very black joke that Stalin told, actually.
There we are.
And this is very good. There was a banquet at the Yalta conference. It was a very small, intimate affair. Kathy Harriman was there, and a number of Stalin's commissars, but obviously Churchill and Roosevelt were there as well. And Kathy writes in her letter that there's one man, one of the commissars she's never seen before. And she says he's this revolting, fat, ugly, red-faced, pitted, disgusting-looking individual. She hadn't seen him before. And Roosevelt as well, he turned to Stalin and said, I haven't seen that one before. And of course, it was Lavrenti Beria. But Roosevelt said, who's that one there? And Stalin says, him? That's our Himmler.
Well, yes, I could see why he didn't go on the stage.
It's sort of black humour, isn't it?
So much of history is about telling good stories, but drawing really interesting links between past and future. And clearly, nobody better at it than our guest today, Giles Milton. Very many thanks for joining us today, sir.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very
Let's have
much.
a clink our glasses.
Absolutely.
Do join us again next time when we will be coming from the Champion Pub in Fitzrovia and talking all things sporting with sports editor, diarist, sketch writer, and blogger Patrick Kidd, who describes himself as a 1920s eccentric trapped in the body of a 21st century journalist. Not a very fetching body either. Not our opinion, his, but he can rest assured that he'll look extremely fetching in our company.